Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep, like really deep, into Palestinian history.
Yeah, we're talking a whole century. A century of events that have shaped the Middle East as we know it. It's a fascinating story.
Absolutely, and we've got some incredible source material to guide us, stuff you don't usually hear.
That's right. We're going to be focusing on the Palestinian viewpoint, looking at how key events, decisions, all of it unfolded from their side of the story.
I think that's going to be super valuable to get that perspective.
I think so too. It's crucial, really crucial for understanding just how complex this conflict is.
Totally agree. So where do we start?
Well, our source material actually takes us straight to Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, okay.
Yeah, to the Khalidi Library.
The Khalidi Library.
Founded back in 1899.
Wow, so over 100 years ago.
Way back. And this place is incredible. It houses manuscripts dating back to the 11th century.
11th century, that's amazing. Like, talk about a real window into the past.
Right.
Yeah.
And get this, the library's founder, he had, wait for it, great-great-great uncle.
Wow, that's a lot of greats. Okay.
Named Yusuf Dia al-Din Pasha al-Khalidi. And this guy,
Yeah.
he actually corresponded with Theodore Herzl.
Herzl, the founder of Zionism.
The one and only.
That's a pretty big deal.
It is. What's fascinating is that these letters, they show us something really important. That even back then, some Palestinians were aware of, like really aware of, Zionist ambitions for Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
Yusuf Dia even raised concerns, about what this could all mean, but it seems those concerns, they weren't taken seriously by at least some of the Zionist leaders.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. It kind of foreshadows the conflict that was to come, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It's like we're getting this glimpse behind the curtain, seeing how things were perceived right at the very beginning.
Exactly. We often hear the Israeli-Palestinian conflict framed as this clash between two peoples, each with an equal claim to the land.
Right.
But our source, it challenges that whole idea. It suggests it's more accurate to view it as a colonial conflict.
Okay, so you're saying it's not that simple.
Not at all. The source even draws parallels between the rhetoric used to describe Palestinians and the language that's been used about other indigenous populations.
Like when they face colonization.
Exactly. It's all about understanding that historical context, the power dynamics.
Okay, yeah. That definitely adds a new layer to how we think about things.
It does.
So, moving on in time, what happens next?
Well, our source takes us to World War I.
World War I, okay.
Yeah, and it had a huge impact on Palestine.
In what way?
I mean, there were shortages, forced conscription, families being torn apart. It was a really chaotic time.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
And then, in the middle of all this chaos, the Ottoman Empire, which ruled Palestine at the time, well, it crumbled.
So it was like a total power vacuum.
Exactly. And that paved the way for the British Mandate in Palestine.
The British Mandate.
And a really, really pivotal document, the Balfour Declaration.
Oh, the Balfour Declaration.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is where things start to get really interesting, right?
It is, yeah. I mean, the Balfour Declaration, it basically promised, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
I can't imagine how that must have felt for the Palestinian population.
Right. Imagine how that landed for the people who already called this land home.
Must have been incredibly unnerving, I would think.
It was a huge source of anxiety. So now you've got the British trying to manage this incredibly delicate situation.
Yeah, I bet.
Trying to balance the aspirations of the Zionist movement.
With the rights of the Palestinians who were already there.
Exactly. And our source really argues, that this whole balancing act was, well, inherently flawed.
Okay, how's that?
It claims that the British Mandate, even though they said they were neutral,
Yeah.
it actually favored the Zionist movement.
Like, they gave them preferential treatment.
In practice, yeah. The mandate had all these provisions for Jewish immigration, land acquisition, even the establishment of Jewish institutions.
So there was this disconnect, like, between what they were saying publicly and what was actually happening on the ground.
A huge one. And there's actually even more to it.
Okay.
The source actually highlights this confidential memo.
A memo.
Written by Lord Balfour himself.
Balfour, the guy behind the declaration.
The architect of the whole thing.
Wow.
And in this memo,
Yeah.
he straight up acknowledges that they basically disregarded Palestinian rights.
To pursue Zionist goals.
Yeah. Talk about a contradiction.
Yeah, that's a pretty big revelation.
Yeah.
So basically, the seeds of discontent were being sown right as the British Mandate was trying to establish itself.
Exactly. And as you might expect, this fueled Palestinian nationalism.
It makes sense. They were being pushed aside.
Right, and newspapers played a big role. Think of intellectuals like Isa al-Isa. They used these platforms to really articulate this distinct Palestinian identity.
And they gave a voice to these growing concerns.
Precisely. It wasn't just about resisting, a policy or a specific group or whatever. It was about asserting their own identity.
Like their right to self-determination.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, this wasn't just a reaction to Zionism.
It wasn't.
No, Palestinian nationalism was also inspired by, things that were happening all over the region.
Okay, so you're talking about a larger context.
Yeah, like the rise of Arab nationalism, the yearning for self-determination that was kind of sweeping through the region at the time.
So their story is part of this much bigger tapestry of history unfolding all around them.
Exactly. And that burgeoning national identity, it also fueled resistance.
Resistance to the British.
To the British and also to Zionist expansion. And this led to a key turning point, the 1936-1939 Arab Revolt.
Oh, wow. That's a big one.
It was a powerful demonstration of the Palestinian people's determination to oppose, both British rule and Zionist expansion.
I bet that revolt must have sent shockwaves through the region.
Oh, it did. While it was ultimately crushed, it really forced the British to reevaluate their policies,
Really? Like how?
Well, it showed the world how deep Palestinian resistance ran.
I can see why that would make them rethink things.
Right. It was a pivotal moment for the Palestinians. It cemented their resolve.
Yeah, the face of all this growing pressure.
Exactly. And then, of course, comes 1948, a year forever etched in Palestinian memory.
1948.
A Nakba.
The Nakba, the catastrophe.
Yes. This is when we see the mass displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians.
And the creation of the State of Israel.
Right. A watershed moment that continues to reverberate to this day.
So we left off talking about 1948 and the Nakba, a truly pivotal moment in Palestinian history.
It was.
So much changed.
Yeah.
Now let's fast forward a bit to 1967 and the Six-Day War.
Another conflict that really reshaped the political landscape of the Middle East.
Definitely. And it had such a huge impact on the Palestinian people.
It did. The Six-Day War, it resulted in a decisive Israeli victory.
Right.
And led to the occupation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip,
Right.
and East Jerusalem.
A lot of territory.
It was significant, a real turning point. But here's the thing.
Okay.
Despite being a military defeat,
Yeah.
the war, it actually reignited Palestinian nationalism.
So even in defeat,
Yeah.
there was this sense of resurgence.
Exactly. The war, it brought the Palestinian issue back to the forefront of international attention.
It put it back on the map, so to speak.
It did, and it fueled this new wave of resistance and activism. It was this time of, both despair and determination.
And during this period, we see the rise of some really influential groups, like the Palestine Liberation Organization.
PLO.
Right, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Their PFLP.
Yeah.
What were their goals?
Well, these groups, they emerged as key players in the Palestinian struggle, and they employed all kinds of strategies, everything from armed struggle to international diplomacy.
There's a pretty wide range. Yeah, but the goal was to advocate for Palestinian rights and self-determination.
The PLO in particular, it went through a significant evolution over time, didn't it?
It did. Initially, they were really committed to armed struggle against Israel.
Makes sense.
But over time, they face a lot of challenges.
Like what?
Internal divisions, complex relationships with the Arab states, and then the rise of Hamas. So they gradually shifted towards accepting a two-state solution.
So that was a pretty big change.
It was a long and complicated journey.
And this brings us to the Oslo Accords. In the 1990s, this period that, it really seemed to hold the promise of peace.
It did. It was a landmark moment, a real glimmer of hope for a peaceful resolution.
Yeah, everyone was so optimistic.
They were, and it was meant to, pave the way for a two-state solution.
An independent Palestinian state, alongside Israel.
Exactly. But the thing is, the Accords, they ultimately failed to deliver on that promise.
What went wrong? Why didn't they achieve lasting peace?
Well, there were several factors, I think.
Okay.
The continued expansion of Israeli settlements.
Right.
In the occupied territories.
Right.
And just the limitations of the Accords themselves, and then the Palestinian Authority, the PA. They became increasingly dependent on Israel. And all of that, it contributed to like this growing sense of disillusionment and frustration among Palestinians.
So instead of bringing peace and self-determination, the Oslo Accords, they kind of backfired.
In a lot of ways, yeah. And this disillusionment, I mean, it was coupled with, the ongoing occupation, the failure of the peace process, and it ultimately erupted into the Second Intifada.
The Second Intifada. That was in the early 2000s, right?
Right.
A period of intense violence.
It was another really tragic chapter in the conflict.
And it really hardened positions on both sides.
It did. And any hope for a quick resolution, well, it basically evaporated.
And then as we move closer to the present, we have to address the situation in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
Which has become increasingly dire.
Gaza has become, it's a truly tragic focal point of the conflict.
It's hard to even fathom the level of suffering that people are enduring there.
It is. The source highlights this thing. It's called the Dahiya Doctrine.
The Dahiya Doctrine, okay.
It basically aims to inflict massive damage on civilian areas.
On civilian?
Yeah, as a form of deterrence, which raises all sorts of ethical questions about, the use of force, the toll it takes on innocent lives.
It just sounds devastating in terms of like the immediate impact, but also the long-term consequences for the people living there.
It is. And then, of course, there's the United States.
Right. A long-standing supporter of Israel.
And a key player
in
attempts to broker peace agreements.
The U.S. role in this conflict has been so complex and controversial.
It has. The U.S., they've consistently positioned themselves as a mediator.
Right.
But that unwavering support for Israel, it's drawn criticism from a lot of people.
They see it as an obstacle, basically, to a truly balanced peace process.
Yeah.
So after all of this deep dive into Palestinian history, where does that leave us? What does the path forward look like?
Well, our source doesn't offer easy answers, but it challenges both Palestinians and Israelis to, confront their own narratives and biases.
To see things from the other side's perspective.
Right. It argues that a just and lasting peace, it requires this fundamental shift in the power dynamics and a real recognition of Palestinian rights.
So equality, self-determination, and end to the occupation.
Yeah. It's a stark assessment, but it's also a call to action.
But where do we fit into all of this? As individuals, just learning about this, why should we even care about Palestinian history and this ongoing struggle for peace?
I think it's important to remember that this conflict, it's not just some distant headline.
Right.
It has global implications. It impacts regional stability, it fuels extremism, and it raises these profound moral questions about justice, about human rights, self-determination.
Things that affect all of us.
They do. And understanding this history, it's crucial to understanding the world we live in.
It helps us connect the dots.
It does. And more importantly, it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and peaceful world.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something we read about. It's a living force that shapes the present and influences the future.
Exactly. And that means we have this responsibility to learn from the past, to critically examine the present, and to work towards a future where peace and justice prevail.
It's not someone else's problem.
It isn't. It's a shared responsibility that demands our attention and our action.
Wow. That was a truly deep dive. We've covered a century of Palestinian history, all the twists and turns, triumphs and tragedies. It's a complex story with no easy answers.
It is. But what makes this deep dive so valuable is that we've explored these events through this Palestinian lens, a perspective that's often overlooked or marginalized in the mainstream narratives.
It's challenged us to consider how the conflict looks from the other side. I was particularly struck by, the argument that Zionism, that it can be viewed as this colonial settler movement.
Right.
It's a powerful statement, one that really shifts how we understand the conflict.
It forces us to confront the power dynamics, the dispossession, and the struggle for self-determination that have been so central to the Palestinian experience.
Yeah.
It also helps us understand, how colonialism has shaped things, the language used to describe Palestinians, the parallels with other indigenous peoples facing similar challenges.
And the story of the Khalidi Library.
Yeah.
With its centuries-old manuscripts.
Right.
And the correspondence between Yusuf D. al-Din Pasha al-Khalidi and Theodore Herzl.
Yeah.
It really highlighted how deep and complex this issue really is.
Absolutely. It's not just some recent conflict. It's deeply rooted in history, in these competing claims, and in this often really tangled web of international involvement.
And untangling that web requires a commitment to understanding, to empathy, and to a willingness to challenge our own preconceived notions.
It does.
The Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, with a mass displacement, and the creation of the State of Israel. I mean, that was a really poignant moment in our exploration.
It was. The Nakba, it's this defining event, collective trauma, that resonates through generations. And it's crucial to acknowledge that suffering, the lasting impact it's had.
Absolutely.
Even as we, grapple with the broader complexities of the conflict.
And then there's the ongoing situation in Gaza. It's this stark reminder of the human cost of this unresolved conflict.
It is. The blockade, the military operations, the humanitarian crisis, it demands our attention.
Our compassion.
It does. And we can't forget the role of the United States.
Right.
A key player in this conflict. And our source was pretty critical of U.S. policy, arguing that it's consistently favored Israel.
Yeah, often at the expense of Palestinian rights. It's a really complicated dynamic for sure. A lot of historical baggage, political pressures at play. But the U.S. has a responsibility, I think, as a global power and a key mediator to pursue a more balanced approach. One that recognizes the aspirations of both sides and prioritizes a just and lasting peace.
I agree.
So after this deep dive, where do we go from here? What can we do as individuals to contribute to a more peaceful future?
I think it starts with education, with seeking out diverse perspectives, with engaging in thoughtful and respectful dialogue.
So being open to different points of view.
Yeah, and it's about challenging those narratives that, perpetuate division and violence, and amplifying the voices of those working for peace and reconciliation.
It's about remembering that this is about real people, real lives affected by this conflict.
It is.
And that peace, true peace, it requires empathy, understanding, and a willingness to build bridges across these divides.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. It's challenged our assumptions, it's broadened our perspectives, and hopefully it's ignited a desire to learn more, to do more, to be part of the solution.
And as we leave this conversation, I'm wondering, could a potential path to peace lie in, like re-examining the very concept of borders? What if, instead of just focusing on dividing the land, we explored models that emphasized, shared resources, economic cooperation,
Interesting.
a vision of coexistence built on mutual respect and, a shared future? What do you think?
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it, to reimagine peace, not just as the absence of conflict, but as this truly shared existence. It is. And it's not about, erasing the past or anything, or diminishing the pain and grievances on either side. It's about acknowledging those complexities, but also daring to, envision a different future.
One where those differences don't define the relationship.
Exactly.
I think what's really resonating with me is this idea that, for real peace, a fundamental shift in perspective.
Yeah.
A willingness to see the other side, not as an adversary, but as a potential partner.
Absolutely. It requires empathy and understanding. That goes beyond just agreeing to disagree.
Right.
It's about actively looking for that common ground, the shared aspirations, building on those.
It's almost like we're talking about a paradigm shift, moving away from this zero-sum game, us versus them, to something more collaborative, where everyone's needs and aspirations are considered.
It is a paradigm shift, and a challenging one for sure, but it's also incredibly inspiring to think about what could happen if we were to really embrace that kind of thinking.
Something that stood out to me in all of this was that emphasis on, the need for both sides to kind of confront their own narratives, their own biases.
It's so easy to get caught up in our own perspective.
Yeah, totally. To only see things from our own point of view.
It's a human tendency, but in a conflict like this, it can be so destructive.
How so?
It prevents us from really understanding the other side, recognizing their humanity, their pain, their aspirations.
It's like we're all trapped in these echo chambers, just reinforcing our own beliefs without ever really engaging with the other side's perspective.
And that's why it's so important to seek out, diverse voices, expose ourselves to different narratives, to challenge our own assumptions.
So it's not just about being open-minded, it's about actively searching for information and perspectives that might challenge our views, being willing to be uncomfortable even.
Right, and that's where education and dialogue, informed dialogue, becomes so important.
Yeah, having those conversations.
We need to move beyond, like, those really simplistic narratives that we often see in the media.
Right.
And really dig into the historical context, the cultural nuances, the lived experiences of those on both sides.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
It is, and it's through that process, of discovery and understanding that we can start to build bridges.
Yeah.
Empathy, compassion, even when there are these deep-seated differences.
It sounds like a long and challenging journey.
Yeah.
But ultimately a really worthwhile one.
It is, and it's a journey we all have a role to play in. Whether it's educating ourselves, engaging in conversations, supporting organizations working for peace, or just simply approaching these issues with empathy and understanding, we can all contribute to a more just and peaceful world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left feeling, I guess, the weight of the challenges, but also the sense of hope for the potential for peace.
Yeah.
Such a complex story. And it requires us to move beyond those simple narratives, to embrace the complexity. It's a story that reminds us of the power of empathy, the importance of dialogue, and the possibility, the real possibility of building a future where those differences, they don't divide us, but they enrich our shared humanity.
Well said. It's been a thought-provoking exploration, and hopefully it leaves our listeners with, a deeper understanding of this issue and a renewed sense of hope for a future where peace and justice prevail.